why do some societies get rich while others don't?
Main driver of economic change is knowledge. Bad institutions and bad allocation of resources, closing the economy up for one reason or another, will keep an economy poor. Just ask everybody living in Russia today. What is the great secret of countries that have succeeded to make the transition from emerging economies to rich economies? Every time we think, oh, by now it's over, everything that can be invented has been invented, and then all of a sudden something new pops up on the horizon. The latest thing, the last year, everybody's talking about is artificial intelligence. I can actually make a list of at least 10 areas that don't get the kind of publicity that AI has been getting, which are at least as important.
Hi, and welcome to today's episode of the Great Tech Game podcast. Today I have the honor, really, and the privilege of having Professor Joel Mokyr with us, who's written several books, several articles that I've been reading now for several years. And today I have the opportunity to speak with him, hopefully go beyond what's written in the many books and articles he's written out there and really get to the heart of some key questions that historians have grappled with, economists have grappled with, policymakers grapple with, and then folks like you and us who are listening to this podcast often wonder about. So welcome, Professor Mokyr. It's a delight to have you here.
Thank you.
So, I think that the first question really, and I want to dive right in, is a question that I think you've probably spent decades now grappling with. So I'm gonna ask that question and then let you run with it. Really, it's a question that's close to my heart. It's a question that, in many ways, was also at the core of the book I wrote, The Great Tech Game, where I looked at what really constitutes the determinants of the winners or nations, which nations win, which societies win in the current tech era. But really, one of the things I try to do in the book as well is to go back into history and try and figure out what had happened in earlier eras, right? And I think that's something you've delved deeply into. So the question is very simply, why do some societies get rich? Why do they grow rich while others don't?
All right. Well, that's we'll spend not just the next hour, but the next week talking about that question. But I will try to give you an answer that will, I think, shed some light on the sort of history of the last 500 or 600 years. So let me start off by citing every economist's idol, which is Adam Smith.
Of course.
And so Adam Smith has a famous statement that everybody cites, and I will read it to you right now. I have it here in front of me. It says, "Little else is required to carry a nation to the highest state of opulence," nice 18th century word, highest state of opulence, "from the lowest barbarism, but peace, easy taxes, and a tolerable administration of justice." Now that sentence has been cited many times. It actually does not appear in the Wealth of Nations, but it, according to his student Dougal Stewart, it appears in some small 1755 manuscript by Smith that Dougal Stewart had seen but was never published. But it's a widely cited book because it gives you the sight of the great master about what actually makes nations rich. And it's striking that it is written in 1755. And that date is significant because 1755, roughly speaking, is the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And the Industrial, the Industrial Revolution, it didn't really begin the way other things began, in the sense that there was no, mass, that attacked the Bastille or anything like that. But historians, I think, can point to a variety of ways in which it happened in the middle of the 18th century. But you see, Adam Smith, in that sentence, clearly has no clue that this is coming. There's no reason he should. But he says, peace and easy taxes and a tolerable administration of justice. And these are things that that enhance commerce, they enhance maybe a better allocation of resources, because we know that taxes distort the allocation of resources. And what he means by a tolerable administration of justice is essentially conflict resolution and property rights enforcement, and all those things that he thought would make a nation rich. He says nothing here in this sentence about science or technology.
Okay.
And it's very striking, because in fact that period is a period in which the way nations get rich starts changing. For thousands of years, what Smith said is absolutely true. If you look at areas that were rich before the Industrial Revolution, you look at, say, the Italian cities during the Renaissance, or, say, the Low Countries during their golden age in the 17th century,
Yeah.
basically they made their money and they got rich primarily through trade and exchange and effective allocation of resources, and basically what we would call good institutions. There was some technological change. There always is a little bit of technological change, but it was never big enough to make a nation rich. It solved some problems, like, say, the introduction of the printing press or windmills. I mean, there's some important inventions, but it's never sustained enough to make a nation rich. The Industrial Revolution is the first case in history in which technology
Yeah.
is actually becoming the major engine of economic change. And you can
That's
see
right.
this in everything that's happening after 1750 or 1760, uh, all the way, say, until the middle of the 19th century, in which we gradually see this sort of hitherto unrecognized part of the economy becoming larger and larger, up to the point where by the middle of the 19th century, really the economy has been made unrecognizable because of
Yeah.
the continuous and sustainable technological change. And what is so striking about the Industrial Revolution, of course, is that it wasn't one of those sort of events in which there's some breakthrough, like the printing press, or that really makes a difference. But then basically things slow down and you go back to some kind of steady state. The Industrial Revolution isn't just a list of inventions, of gimmicks that sweep the British economy and later on the rest of the world, but it is the beginning of a process that builds on itself. Technological change is self-reinforcing, and it's still going on. There is no sign that it's slowing down. It's changing its nature. It's becoming. Some things are and that affect its dynamic. But basically, we're still living in an age in which change is become the norm, and it continues to affect the economy and people's lives every day. That's never been the case. So the answer to their question is basically, before the Industrial Revolution, it really is Smithian. It is institutions, it's gains from trade, it's effective allocation of resources, and it's peace. But today, these things still matter. War is still bad, and you still want to have a good allocation of resources. But the main driver of economic change is knowledge. And knowledge includes, of course, technology and how to make things, but it's also what's behind the technology. And what is behind the technology, of course, and more than anything else, uh, is why this technology works. How do we develop it? And you could call this science. I call it the sort of the union of the two groups of technology here, science. I call useful knowledge. That's a term I like, because that's what they use in the 18th century. In the 18th century, they talk about useful knowledge, and they know what it means. It means basically knowledge that is either useful today or could become
Useful.
useful at some point in the way we understand energy, the way we
Yeah.
understand material, the way we understand chemistry, the way we understand the living world around us, and on and on and on and on. That understanding then creates, with some luck and some hard work, new techniques that make life better and that make the economy grow. Now, that doesn't mean the ones that Smith is talking about don't matter, okay? I keep saying this, bad institutions and bad allocation of resources and closing the economy up for one reason or another will keep an economy poor. Just ask everybody living in Russia today. Uh, that's but
Yeah.
what's happening in the West and what is happening in the industrialized world and what is happening in many emerging economies is is in addition to all these things, they are adopting or developing new techniques. Now, and I think that if you ask yourself, what is the great secret of countries that have succeeded to make the transition from emerging economies to rich economies? And I'm not so much talking about China here, which is a special case, but you look at the Asian tigers. You look at South Korea, you look at Taiwan, you look at Singapore. What they have done essentially is taken Western technology, tweaked it, improved it, adapted it, and then turned it into a source of wealth. That's why South Korea today is by your definition, a rich economy. They have had the wherewithal and the capability of adopting Western technology. And so my sense is that that's the main engine today that is driving the economy, and it will be driving the world. And you can trade is good. I'm an economist. I love trade. I think trade is fantastic, and it sort of breaks my heart to see what is happening to trade today with deglobalization and the worsening international climate for trade and the American protectionism and the EU protectionism. Not to say anything about Chinese protectionism. I hate these things, but that's not where the main action is
The
going
main
to be.
determinant. Right.
It's
Well,
about knowledge.
Yeah, many of the Smithian things, right, that you refer to, they seem to be in my mind, two things, right? One is that they seem to be necessary today, but not sufficient. Again, in economists speak, right? If you don't have them, you'll struggle. But if you have them, doesn't mean you'll be rich. You need that magic ingredient that you're talking about, which is that useful knowledge piece or tech creativity, as I think sometimes you've called it, seems to be that magic portion on top, right?
Absolutely.
That it as a country today. But let me do one thing. I'm going to come back to this piece and dig deeper. But I want to, because I know that you love history and I love too, I'm going to actually try and take us back even further into history, right? So we've spoken about obviously the Industrial Revolution analogs, but let's go back even further. We've talked about global trade a little bit, but let's go back to agriculture. In my book, as I was mentioning when we started, Professor Mokyr, I start off from the advent of agriculture and I say, let's go back all the way there and think about the great eras that we've lived through. And I identify 5 or 6 of them, starting with agriculture. And I say that, much like others have said, once we make that transition from hunter-gatherer societies to agriculture-driven societies is where we really see modern society emerge and the complexity of the organization within society emerge. So I start there. And then I come to global trade and I come to industrialization, colonization, and then I come to capitalism and then eventually technology now. But if I go back to agriculture, and if I can ask you to go back to that era, let's think about why certain nations or certain regions, let's say the nations don't exist at that, certain regions, why do certain regions then at that time become richer than others?
Well, I think in some part that clearly has to do with things what you do with your agricultural product. So, for instance, one of the main drivers of the rise of prosperity in a pre-industrial society is, in fact, specialization and the division of labor, both regional and amongst individuals. So, the one episode which we know there's 2 episodes that we know a fair amount about, is the Roman Empire and China under the Tang and Song dynasties, which is lasting basically roughly from about 600 AD till about 1250 or something like that. And in both cases, agricultural productivity and agricultural prosperity are enhanced by specialization. And the reason that you specialize in agriculture is no secret, of course. There's a great deal of heterogeneity in topographical and climatic conditions, and so it makes sense for the south of China to produce rice and the north of China to produce wheat, and then you send things along, along the coast or through the Grand Canal. And the same is true about Europe. In the Roman Empire was rich, or it got to be rich, because it was a commercial economy that was concentrated around mostly around the Mediterranean, and so they traded in the things that they needed, which is, of course, wheat and wine and olive oil and textiles and things like that. And so we know that these things were moved around at huge numbers. And Economics 101 explains that this division of labor, and this is in Adam Smith in the first chapter, the division of labor and specialization make nations richer. And the nice thing about it, which is every econ graduate student loves teaching that to the undergraduates, is it's a positive sum game. Everybody gains. The notion that if I trade with you and that makes me richer, therefore it makes you poor, that's nonsense. We know that when you trade, both sides get better. But here is the kicker. Here's the kicker, okay? And this is what basically why we don't see an industrial revolution in China or in the Roman Empire, and that is because gains from trade, gains from specialization, these things run into diminishing returns. At some point, trade's already there, you are richer, but you're not going to get much more richer because, basically all the trade that can take place has already been taking place. And the best example I can think of that is in our own time. If you look at Europe, okay, so Europe in 1957 started to integrate, create a single large market. And there were huge gains from that because they started trading and specializing. But you ask yourself, can that go on? And the answer is basically, it's the gains will get smaller and smaller because you already exhausted it. The only thing that never has run into diminishing returns, and there's no evidence that it ever will, so who knows, is increases in knowledge. And, every time we think, oh, by now it's over, everything that can be invented has been invented, and then all of a sudden something new pops up on the horizon. The latest thing, the last year, everybody's talking about is artificial intelligence. I can actually make a list of at least 10 areas that don't get the kind of publicity that AI has been getting, which are at least as important, including breakthroughs in material science, breakthrough in molecular biology. I mean, there's things going on that are just mind-boggling.
I agree.
And there's no evidence that this is ever going to run out, because, as I have argued repeatedly, every individual has obviously a limit on what this brain can produce.
True.
But society is the union of these individuals, and there is no reason to believe that there's ever going to be a limit on what we can and are able to do. And so if you want to have not just getting, you asked a question about prosperity, and that's the one about level. But of course, the historian is interested in the level and in the rate of change. And the rate of change is basically, I think, determined by laws of diminishing returns. And the only area where these laws don't seem to apply, I say seem because who knows, but they don't seem to apply, is in the expansion of knowledge. And what is amazing is that, particularly this is true for the Roman Empire, there was almost no technological change under the Roman Empire. They were literate, they were smart, they were well organized, but we see almost no change. I mean, if you push me hard enough, I'll come up with some example, but it's fairly rare. It's better in China because, particularly in the Song dynasty, there are some major breakthroughs. But then, after 1279, when the Mongols come, it basically disappears. And by the 1400, 1500, China has become a technologically static society, and for 400 years, there is no major advances that you can see happening in China, whereas in Europe, things are getting faster and faster and faster.
That's right. That's right. No, so there's another way to think about it, and I think the way I thought about it and wrote about it,
Yes.
in fact, very similar to how you're outlining it, which is slightly different use of terminology. Maybe was I was looking at the factors of production. Again, as a
Yeah.
student of economics, one of the first things you're taught is the different factors of production and how they contribute to GDP and growth. And
Yes.
as I tried to almost
Yeah.
superimpose those factors of production, land, labor, capital, etc., onto the great games of what I call the great games of the past or the great eras of the past, I saw some interesting linkages, right? So you go back to agriculture, and really what you're looking to do is increase the productivity of the land, right? To become richer than the other. Before you can even trade, you've got to get more productive, right? So people talk about the use of Neolithic technology. Mesopotamia becomes more productive, the right crop selection, irrigation technology, all of that to make you more productive,
Mm.
land that you are doing agriculture on more productive. You move on a little bit, and at some point you start to see that along with the land, the labor is equally important, right? Um, and then I think it's only until when global trade really picks up, and especially in the last 400, 500 years, where now capital, in terms of financial capital, to be able to trade, to invest, etc., becomes critical, right? And the height of that, in a way, is like, to me, industrial capitalism, right? Where the accumulation of capital allows you to get richer and richer because you can set up more factories, invest more, build more railways, etc. And on the other hand, countries like India that get depleted of capital, the third main factor of production, start to see their prosperity decline. And then the residual factor of production for us is technology, or what you call knowledge, right, in our conversation. And as I have understood, right, all of the first three factors of production, land, labor, and let's say financial capital, have seen the point that you are making, which is diminishing returns, right? Marginal returns. But is that technology or useful knowledge piece that is continuing to see um, not suffer from that problem, but also helping the other factors of production become more productive.
Absolutely.
So technology is letting, I've been in the venture capital world for the last decade, and I've seen this very clearly. Today, capital is chasing technology, right, to get its returns. So in a way, like, it's just
Yeah.
another way to think about it, but it's pretty much exactly
No,
what you were saying, that
it's
today
basically just
that's the key factor of production.
it's basically just the same way of thinking about it. I'll give you one kind of example. Since you're interested in agriculture, I'll give you one interesting example of agriculture and how these things really are equivalent. So you think about how much food can an acre of land produce, okay? And so one of the things that humans discovered many centuries ago is that if you take certain substances, basically animal dung, one form or another, and you put it on the land, it could be other substances, but it's basically fertilizer, right? You put it on the land, you increase the productivity
That's right.
of the land, right? So it's fertilizer. And people be using fertilizer. They're basically, medieval cities have these guys who collect human waste and haul it to the field and spread it. Not a job that I would apply for, but it had to be done. And so, but here's what's interesting, Anirudh, and that is nobody had any idea of why this
Why?
worked. I mean, what is it that animal or human excrement does to create better crops? So people experimented with all kind of things, and this works, this doesn't work. I don't know why, but that's how it is. And so you can see agricultural productivity going up as people are able to improve the sort of supply chains of fertilizer. And they also learn a few other things like crop rotation and so on and so forth. But basically, agricultural productivity, it does increase over time, but extremely slowly.
Yeah.
Okay, and so, but it's there, and then comes the 19th century, and people are starting to do essentially an analysis of what the chemical elements are that crops need. And they say, hey, these crops need more nitrates and these crops need more phosphates. And
Phosphates.
well, by 1700, nobody even knows what nitrates and phosphates were.
Yeah.
And then you get these mostly Germans, like Justus von Liebig and Wöhler, we know who these people were. By 1850, 1860, people have a much better idea of how to, what is it that makes land productive. And so, well, there are various problems that have to be solved, near where you get the nitrates, on and on. But basically, by 1900, most of this stuff is well understood. And the result is that all of a sudden our planet can feed, instead of 2 billion people, 8 billion people. And they feed them at a higher level because we are much better fed on average. I'm saying on average. Humanity is better fed now than it was in 1900. So not only are we feeding more people, we're feeding them better. And so that is how knowledge augments, the technological, the productive capabilities of land. Now, you can do exactly the same arguments for labor. You can make exactly the same arguments for capital, because capital is more productive, when you are buying a piece of equipment that embodies a better technology. Okay, so every time, I'm now much less so than in the past, but for years, my productivity went up because I spent capital, so to speak, buying a better computer that could do my regressions faster, that could, do all kinds of things that I couldn't do now. And so it's exactly the point. But in a world in which knowledge is static, in which there is no improvements in knowledge that are of any significance, like, say, much of medieval Europe and China after the Mongols and so on, these factors are going to run into diminishing returns. You can still get positive returns. You can still squeeze more out of them. But every time you squeeze more out of them, the next time it's going to be harder and harder and harder. And eventually society becomes static. And for most of human history, there has been very little economic growth. And people have come up with different arguments about this. They talked about Malthusian models, and this is all true and fine. But the main reason why nations were poor and humanity was poor is that by our criteria, they just didn't know enough. It's, here is another example which I tell my students about. So it's not just things like fertilizer and agriculture. One of the things that really matter to people are materials. Without materials, lots of things that you'd like, we sort of take this for granted, but it isn't for granted. And so one of the things that were discovered in earlier times was steel. Okay, so steel was used, it was used in Japan, it was used in China, it was used in the Middle East, it was used in Europe for basically high quality metal tools, right? So swords and daggers and, things of that nature. Now, here's an interesting thing. Nobody knew what steel was. It's kind of odd. They knew how to make it. Blacksmiths taught their apprentices, this is how you do it. You heat it, you put it in water, you hammer it, you blah, blah, blah. But why and what is this all about? Nobody knew. And then, all of a sudden, in the late 18th century, people discover why steel has these capabilities of flexibility and resilience and so on and so forth. And they discover, what steel, and eventually, takes a little while, but eventually they discover how to make cheap steel of very high quality. It changed the world. Steel is, we can't imagine what our world would look like. I'm looking out of the Chicago skyline from my office. I see buildings that are 90 stories high. You couldn't make those without steel.
That's right.
You couldn't make the machinery that's running our world without steel. You couldn't make it out of cast iron. People, have to understand what the things are that they are manipulating.
That's
Now, it's possible to manipulate things without understanding it, but if you do that, you're gonna be essentially hitting a ceiling pretty quickly. And that is why nations don't grow very quick, because they just don't know enough. Once the knowledge breaks through, once we as a society, and I'm talking about a global society here, really, because
yeah,
knowledge obviously is, it moves across national boundaries. Once we start understanding the principles of physics, of chemistry, of botany and genetics, and so on and so forth, basically the sky is the limit. And of course, as we learn more about why these things work, we can make better tools, and we can push science even further. So it's not just that science supports technology; technology supports science, and what you get is this positive feedback effect between these two things, both moving, and they are co-evolving.
yeah.
And the real question, the real hard question, which I have no answer to, is: will this ever converge? Will this ever settle down? And I don't know. Nobody knows. But there
Well,
seems to be no reason why it should. On the other hand, it's sort of hard to imagine, if we keep going at the rate that we've been going at in the last 150 years, what the world would look like in 2500. And that's very hard to imagine.
yeah. No, that's right. I mean, one can imagine that the kind of optimism you have right now for the increasing returns to useful knowledge and technology science might have been shared by the people who discovered agriculture back in the day, right? By the people who discovered trade. That, listen, there's no end to this. We can keep doing this, right? That there's more and more land, right? And of course, at some point, constraints can come. Fundamentally, technology maybe doesn't suffer from the physical constraints that maybe land and labor and trade seem to suffer from. But yeah, I think that there might be other ways that this technology diffusion and creation gets limited, or at least changed, right? Because when you mention material science and when you were mentioning steel, the talk now is about how bad steel is from a climate standpoint.
Oh, yeah, but that's
Right.
that's
So,
that's
so
that's
that's
a very
why you
different.
make but
That's
material
a
science
very different.
makes
Sorry.
sense, right? I mean,
No, no, I
materials are
agree.
that much more important because at some point now we're realizing that we are hitting some kind of constraint on how much steel we can produce,
Yeah, and
right?
I,
Because we
I,
don't
I,
want
I totally agree, and that's not just true for steel. That's true for cement.
10
In
things,
fact,
correct?
cement is more harmful than steel because we use a lot more of it,
That's
but
right.
also because making it as major environmental impact. And,
That's right. That's
we could talk about that. And I'm not trying to make a case here for how great steel was. I'm making a case that without knowledge of what something is,
we can't
it's
can't see those increased returns.
you can, yeah, exactly. But uh, but of course, what that also implies is that if you know enough about materials and you discover one day that cement or steel or fossil fuels or a whole bunch of other things, nitrates, they all cause major environmental damage because you know what they do and why they do what they're doing.
That's right.
You can come up with substitutes. I mean,
Absolutely.
you can come up with substitutes. So here's an example. You look at nitrates. So nitrates is a big deal in agriculture, right? Now we also know that by overusing nitrates, we're essentially destroying groundwater, uh, and as well as eventually it finds its way to the oceans, and it creates these huge dead spots because of the proliferation of algae. So, so at some point we're going to have to stop this nitrate. And then the question is, can we create,
Good.
the conditions in which we don't suffer from crops? And the answer is, we could, by genetic manipulation of plants so that they use less nitrates. Because we know that some plants need more nitrates than others. We can
Agree.
look at the ones that need less nitrates and say, can we transplant their genes into other plants so that they can flourish without these huge amounts of nitrates? The same would be true for steel. I mean, you're absolutely right about the environmental impact of steel, but I would say our knowledge allows us maybe to design alternative materials, ceramics, synthetics, I don't know what, and replace steel in big buildings and machinery and so on. In fact, material scientists have been doing this for the last 25 years. And essentially, what is so great is that today new materials are actually being designed using artificial intelligence,
Correct.
which can do it 1,000 times faster than we can. So if you're worried about steel, what you need to get is artificial intelligence to help you design from the molecular level up new materials that do what steel are doing without the nasty side effects on the environment.
No,
Well,
that's right. And so the question that raises in my mind is, another way of saying what you're saying is, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, but another way of saying what you're saying is R&D, right? Fundamental research. Now, as I studied, from my perspective, the success factors of nations, especially in the last 200, 250 years, when technology starts to become a much bigger determinant of the wealth of nations, to use Adam Smith again for a second. Now, one of the things you realize is that maybe there was a time when technology was easily shared, openly shared, but we don't live in that era anymore. And now, in a heavily IP protected knowledge world, R&D seems to be a core competence that nations have focused on to build that kind of fundamental knowledge, understanding, and then to build applications on top to become more prosperous than the others who've not been able to do it or who've chosen not to do it, right? So one of the complaints that people make about countries like India as well, domestically in India is, and I'm a pretty big vocal critic of this, is that India is not doing enough R&D, right? Now, I want to get more into this R&D piece because I know you've written about this. Talk to me about your views on R&D as a process. I know you've mentioned that, I think a quote, if I can pick it up from one of your writings, was that you think that tech change can hardly be regarded as the consequence of an orderly process of R&D, right? But talk to me about, one, what importance do you assign to R&D in today's, what I call the great tech game, where tech is determining your economic prosperity? And second, how can nations cultivate it if it doesn't exist? And it goes back to your point about tech creativity. If certain countries are more tech creative, others are not, the question really, in my mind, is how can those countries become more tech creative? How can they do more R&D? Is it just a matter of money, or is there more to it?
No, I think it's a matter of many things. And these are very hard. These are very hard questions. But to some extent, I think the limitations of intellectual property rights and the patent system and other forms of protecting your intellectual property right. I mean, these are essentially temporary things, right? So patents run out after 15 years, and eventually there's seems to be few institutional barriers for the flow of technology. I'm not thinking about 5 years. In the short term, yes, but over long term, you can sort of see how these Asian tigers, which I talked about, essentially built economic prosperity basically on knowledge that was by and large generated in the Western world. I mean, for better or for worse, this is true. You look at what China has done and essentially what they've been doing. They've been producing very similar goods that the West has been producing for a much longer time, but they do it better, they do it cheaper, they do it faster, they whatever. But it's not like they develop these goods. So this knowledge does flow across borders. I mean, look at India if you want. You look at the pharmaceutical industry in India. Right. A lot of this is essentially making generic
thing is reverse. Yeah. In a way, if you think about it, in a historical context, it's like a reversal. You read about the China that you were talking about, that after the Mongols, they stopped innovating.
But
right,
so
Europe takes that technology and says, we're gonna make it better.
So here is my take on this, and you can take it or leave it. Okay? But for me, what makes a society creative and successful is its willingness to engage nonconformism and to be pluralist, and to encourage people to think outside the box. And not all societies have that. For instance, my sense is that most autocratic totalitarian regimes basically fail to see that. One of the great mysteries of 20th century history is the failure of the Soviet Union to take technological leadership over the West. And I still remember, I'm old enough to remember, vaguely now, I must say, the launching of the first Sputniks in 1957. And essentially, all those experts, including great economists in the United States, basically said, they have a better system than we do, and they will bury us, as Khrushchev said.
Right.
And because they launched the Sputnik, and then they launched Yuri Gagarin, and they took the lead in and we all thought, oh my God, that system is technologically much more successful than the West. And that turned out to be completely false. And the reason it's false is because you need societies in which are tolerant of people who have crazy ideas. And out of 100 crazy ideas, 99 of them are going to be completely useless by, crazy ideas thought of by crackpots which could never work. And the one will change the world, but you don't know which one. So you have to tolerate all 100. And I think that is what did in the Soviet Union technologically, and eventually it will be very difficult for China to maintain the kind of autocratic totalitarian regime that has been regrowing, I said, coming back in China under Xi Jinping. And I think eventually it means that they will lose the technological race in the West. Not because there's something inherently about Chinese culture that's nonsense. What it is you need people to think freely and speak their mind. And once you allow that, it can't be just people speaking freely on, technical issues in, I don't know what, material science or molecular biology. You have to let them speak freely about anything. So I grew up in Israel, and I still have very strong connections there. And the saying in Israel always was, it's not that people think outside the box. It's that there's no box. And if you've ever spent any time in Israel, people really, are basically trying always to think differently from others and try new things. And most of these things fail because that's the nature of the beast. But they have had enough successes for their R&D to be hugely successful. Now, that's one thing. It's a culture of pluralism, tolerance, and nonconformism that really matters. And that's part of that is a matter of policy. So in the Soviet Union, clearly under Stalin, there was none. But even after that, it didn't get all that much better. It's certainly true in China today. Whereas in the U.S., for all its faults, for all its things that I disagree with, but there basically is a notion of tolerance, of people with crazy ideas. I mean, you want to try it, see what happens, that kind of thing. One of the things that seems to be hardwired in us for reasons that I'm not sure about is the huge respect for the thoughts and knowledge of earlier generations. One of the things that the internet age and modern capitalism has done, it has actually brought back the sort of single entrepreneur as a major player in the evolution of capitalism. I can easily see in 10 years Microsoft going the way that Kodak and Polaroid and Xerox went.